the Jack Dorsey. I don't have a beard, so I don't know how I can be viewed as Jack Dorsey. So thanks, Street Fight, for having me. Nice to be here with everybody in the local community. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes to solve all of the location problems as they exist in the ecosystem today. We'll talk through beacons, attribution, IDFAs, you name it. So maybe just quickly, show of hands in this audience, does everybody know what an identifier is, an IDFA? If you know what an IDFA is, put your hand up. Okay. So we'll get into that, and it's important that everybody understands what an IDFA is or what an Android identifier is. That is the currency of local, specifically in mobile moving forward. Everything that you are doing moving forward in mobile should be hunting the IDFA or the identifier. It is fundamentally replacing the cookie. If you or your organization or your brand is not doing that, you are falling further and further behind. So with that, as mentioned, I'm Neil Sweeney. I'm the founder of Freckle. Freckle is a software company that helps brands really uncover true attribution through the use of software, beacons, and sensors. As was mentioned in the intro, Freckle was incubated actually inside of another company that I had about a year and a half ago, really with the understanding that every product doesn't solve every problem in the ecosystem. It's just the reality. It solves a lot of them, but it doesn't solve all of them. And I think what we found, having been in the programmatic space, in the mobile programmatic space for quite some time, was that there's some fundamental flaws as they exist today, namely specifically around location. There's some dirty secrets in mobile, specifically around location, specifically how they're getting surfaced in bidstream data, as well as around attribution. I think what we're all finding is that as we move through this ecosystem or we move through the space, people want more transparency, they want more accountability, they want to get closer to the till. So everything that you're using today in the mobile ecosystem, you're still to a certain degree are inferring at the last mile. And I think for us, inside of Freckle, that's really what we were trying to actually solve. So maybe just a quick refresher specifically on beacons and how people are actually using them. This is the typical use case of how people are using beacons. So major retailer deploys a handful of beacons around a handful of stores, implements software and SDK specifically into an individual retailer application, and then when an individual who has Bluetooth on walks in contact or into the radius of one of these individual beacons, bang, they're actually pushed this individual message. So this is typically how most people actually talk about beacons, and this actually doesn't work. Okay, so fundamentally, it's a ton of work. It has absolutely no scale. And if you actually do it, how many messages am I going to send you as an individual, specifically from Macy's or Home Depot? 1, 2, 3. More often than not, people fail to realize that you're actually creating a negative brand experience if not executed properly. So what I've often said to people is messaging can actually work, but it actually has to be done absolutely perfectly. So while this lacks scale, if not done perfectly, it actually is borderline spam. And for those of us who've been in mobile for quite some time, so I started in SMS many moons ago, this is eerily similar to what we were doing with SMS back in the old days. So here's a couple of other things everybody needs to know about beacons. One is beacons are not about push. They're actually not also about hardware. This is the other thing everybody wants to fixate on. You could have 1 million beacons in this room attached to every fixture in this room. The reality is they're completely and fundamentally useless unless you have software in the phone that actually interacts with them. So stop thinking about the hardware. Stop thinking about the notification. They are 100% about data, period. Everything that we are doing in this market, everything we are doing in mobile is increasingly more about data. And more specifically, it is entirely about fine-grained location and closed-loop attribution. How does this data help you actually solve these two issues? We'll specifically get into that. So just a quick summary on how an individual beacon works, just so we can actually set the table. So there's a number of individual components that you actually need to actually execute a beacon campaign. So one, you need a beacon, so you need the actual physical hardware. Secondly, you need an SDK or software that goes inside of an application, which goes inside of an actual phone. The application in the phone is a vehicle or a vessel for carrying that SDK. Without the SDK, the beacon is pretty much useless. In addition to that, when an SDK or an application comes in contact with a beacon, it kicks off a lot of different variables, the most important being that identifier. So that IDFA that we talked about is unique, obviously, to the iOS device. Android has a similar one. It is the cookie of mobile. It allows you to actually track people as they actually move around in the same way that people actually track you online. That, as things increasingly move to mobile, is important for you to be layering into your individual data strategy. The reason I show you this is because at Freckle, what we really focus on is we focus on the software and the data side of the business. So yes, we have a proximity SDK that we license to a number of different applications, because in that earlier example, which I actually went through specifically with Macy's, what we talked about there was there's no scale. And the reason why there's no scale in that typical push type of scenario is that in the case of, say, Macy's, if they have 5 million downloads, to get an actual push message or to interact with the beacon, you needed to actually have Bluetooth on. That cuts your install base in half. You need to have location services on. That cuts your location in half again. So you quickly ladder down to an actually very, very small base. At Freckle, what we do, we actually license our proximity SDK to thousands of individual applications to actually solve that problem. We are providing the scale to the audience for the actual proximity space. So I mentioned this before, IDFAs are the actual new currency. They represent the foundation of everything that you're doing. And I think for us, where we think the biggest opportunity in this space is really based on solving these issues. One, there's 3 core facts. One, mobile advertising is a $100 billion global market. The number 1 targeting variable in that market is location. 70% of the location information that is surfacing in actual bidstream data is inaccurate. 70%, not 7, 70%. And that's not necessarily outright malicious fraud. A lot of it is the way in which you actually build locations, how your actual location services work, some of the limitations of GPS. Think about this. Every major brand, multiple companies are actually pushing this notion of actually using mobile as a targeting methodology when the core functionality of it is 70% of the time inaccurate. At Freckle, what we do is when you're interacting with a physical beacon, that's a real device with a real location associated to it, with real people. That's real attribution in our case. So if we step back from a minute and actually look a little bit about how location has actually evolved over the last number of years, we've always started with this macro approach. So this is the United States. Let's do a national campaign. Let's do a state campaign. Then let's do a city campaign. A number of years ago, we actually came across real-time, which in a bid stream, when you actually bid on an impression, you actually get the actual location information and you get that identifier. The reality, though, is you can't fundamentally determine whether or not this person's been in store. So the way in which we qualify, the way in which we categorize bid stream location data is that it's probabilistic. Probabilistic meaning is that you think it is, but it's not 100%. How many people did you really drive in store by using all of that location information? How can you really prove it? Fundamentally, if you're acquiring or buying location from bid stream data, your location is inferred, period, and it's inherently flawed. So let's flip it around. If we look at what's actually taking place specifically in the ecosystem today, who are the companies that are dominating? These ones. And the reason that they're doing that is because each of these companies has a deterministic ID. A deterministic ID being login information, which allows you to basically talk to people cross-platform. So probabilistic versus a deterministic ID, there's a reason why Facebook is one of the biggest companies or is the biggest company in the mobile space or in the media space. So for us at Freckle, what we think is interesting is how can we apply a deterministic ID to actual location? Well, we can do that if you go not from an outside-in perspective, but from an inside-out perspective. When your handset comes in contact with the beacon, you're actually collecting an identifier. That is, you know definitively that this person is in a store. You know definitively that this person is in aisle 3. You know definitively that this person is in this specific location. You implement that IDFA into your data strategy, and as the individual comes in contact with beacons in a variety of other places, your ability to map this person grows in time. To us, that's an actual deterministic ID for attribution. That's it. Any questions on that? It's a lot of information in a short period of time. No? Okay, thanks guys.